Hello, it's the Japan Zoomina at UC San Diego. This July 13th, 2021, which makes it July 14th, 2021 in Tokyo. Ohayo gozaimasu. I'm Ulrike Schede, professor of Japanese business at UC San Diego and the director of JFIT, the Japan Forum for Innovation and Technology. We are at UC San Diego, the School of Global Policy and Strategy, or GPS for short. If you're interested in our activities at GPS, including our various degree programs, please visit gps.ucsd.edu. And JFIT is our Japan Center at GPS. You can find more information about us at jfit.ucsd.edu. When you go to that website, you can, I want to guide you to two buttons in particular. One is the News and Media tab, where you can sign up for our JFIT San Diego, Japan newsflash, the news from Japan, or the news that you would not read in the newspaper. It's a bi-weekly little reminder that we exist. Right next to it is the Japan Zoominars tab. Here you can find recordings of our past Zoominars, as well as an opportunity to sign up for upcoming ones. Please note that our Zoominars are recorded, and later on today, when you type questions into the Q&A and I relate them to our guest today, I will refer to you only by your first name to secure your privacy. And before I introduce today's speaker, let me point out that next week we'll have Dave Lahaney from Waseda University to talk about thwarted commemorations and the un-Olympics or no Olympics as they are being discussed in Japan right now. And today we have Azby Brown, so let me stop. We have Azby Brown here, who will talk with us about architecture and design for sustainability. Hello, Azby, welcome to the Zoominar. And before I introduce you, I should also say we made one technology change. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you will now see the live transcript option. You can turn it on or off or make it big on the side. And we hope you like this as an experiment. We're doing this as a service. If it doesn't work, we'll turn it back off. Let's leave it on for today. So here's Azby. He's a visiting professor at the Musashino Art University in Tokyo, where he works in the sculpture department. He earned his degree from Yale in 1980 in fine art and sculpture, and was disappointed at the time that there weren't really courses in architecture. So he found his way to architecture and worked at a New York festival, Seiyo department store, where carpentry was a theme, which got him to Japan on a Mambusho grant in 1985. He's lived in Japan since then. He has held various positions, including at the Kanazawa Kogyo Daigaku for 20 years, where he led the architecture department, as well as began to work on Edo and architecture in the Edo period at a place called the Future Design Institute. And he'll explain to us today how his view of history has shaped his view of what we can do going forward to design places and spaces for sustainability. The other important thing that Azby has done is that he works with and for Safecast, which is a global citizen-based science project for environmental monitoring. And this grew out of the Fukushima earthquake, where of course there was a lot of monitoring to be done. And that further brought in your concern about the environment and sustainability together with the design and architecture. So all of this is very exciting to me. So let me stop talking and say hello to Azby. Welcome to the Japan Zoominar.
Hello, thanks for having me.
So Azby, you want to start us out with a few thoughts on your view of the role of architecture and design in terms of sustainability and environment?
Yeah, I have some slides and things to show, and I think I'll be able to do it in about 10 minutes. Hope I don't go too much over. Let me share the presentation. So, are we shared? Is it good?
Yes, yes, you are. Excellent.
So yes, I'm Azby Brown, and I really am happy to be here. I'll talk about two related aspects of my own work, and that I think are very important for us to think about going forward. One is about carpentry in Japan, the sort of environmental sensibility of carpentry, particularly temple carpentry, what's called miyadaiku, and the other is the aspects of how the Edo period did remarkable things regarding resource management and design, which really makes it a model for us today. As you introduced me, I became interested in Japanese architecture and design when I was an undergraduate at Yale, and there were no courses in that. But I did my own individual study and learned a lot about it, and was able to find a way to come to Japan in 1983. And I was fortunate to meet this man, Tsunekazu Nishioka, and it's a long sort of chance and serendipity that brought me into contact with him. He was the last great temple carpenter of Japan, and he died in 1995. His family was the hereditary carpenters for Horyuji Temple in Nara, and in the latter part of his career, he became the temple carpenter for Yakushiji Temple, also in Nara. And this was originally built in 710 AD. So like Horyuji, it's over 1,300 years old. Almost nothing of the original temple still stood at the time, except for this one pagoda, the Eastern Pagoda, called the Toto, and this is from 700 AD. And remarkably, it has withstood. It's a real testament to the skill and the knowledge and the wisdom of the carpenters. Now, not every piece of wood in this is from this period. It's been constantly refurbished and upgraded, but this is, a remarkable monument to Japanese skill and ability of the time. What Nishioka-san did, one of the remarkable things he did was he rebuilt the Western Pagoda. There were originally a pair, and he rebuilt the Western one, completed in 1981. Took about 20 years, and it is, again, a testament to his skill and his ability. So I was lucky to be able to learn from him at his site. I did not become a carpenter under his tutelage, but I became kind of a special disciple, documenting his work and passing it on. And this became a book called The Genius of Japanese Carpentry. The first edition was published in 1988, and in 2014, an expanded version was published, and actually a new edition of that will be out in the fall. And it documents the work and the thinking, and lots of photographs and illustrations describing it. Like a lot of people, especially in the West, what I was first interested in about Japanese carpentry was joinery, how the wood was connected, these fabulously intricate joints. Which, there was a tradition in the West as well, which basically died out, at the time of the Industrial Revolution. But in Japan, this is an unbroken line of teaching and learning and of skill up to the present, which is now unfortunately disappearing during our generation. But then as I spent time with Master Nishioka, I realized the important things was not the joints, it was the wood and the people. And this is some large logs of hinoki wood, which is a Japanese, which is a cypress. Actually, these came from Taiwan, which was used in the temple. And this is sort of a timeline continuum. It may be a little small on some people's screens, but at the bottom is 500 BC, and I put Shakyamuni. That was the time of the historical Buddha, for instance. And up towards the top, we're into the 21st century. I've expanded it to the right to show the time period of building the temple, Yakuji, rebuilding that. And what I want to point out is that the trees that were used in building Yakushiji originally were 1,000 years old. That meant that they were seedlings around 300 BC. So this is, very, very ancient. This is the Jomon period in Japan. This is, ancient Greece. This is, the beginning of the Roman Empire. It's an incredible span of time to when it's built in around 700 AD, and then it continues in existence for 1,300 more years until the present. So this is a 2,000-year time span, and Master Nishioka thought in terms of that kind of time span. Everything was, what's it going to be like 1,000 years from now? What will it be like hundreds of years from now? How can we build something of wood that will endure that long? And it really meant understanding the environment, understanding wood, understanding its characteristics as part of the environment. And this is Nishioka's own calligraphy of the oral teachings called Kuden, which were handed down. And I'll just touch on a few of these. One is, don't buy lumber for building material, buy a whole mountain. And another was use the wood in the same north, south, east, west orientation that originally grew. And this sounds unusual, but in fact, this was how it was done in the past. And at the bottom of this image, different parts of the mountain allowed wood with different characteristics to grow. And its orientation in terms of the sun and wind, et cetera, affect the wood itself. And if it is used in the building in the same orientation, it's more likely to remain stable and actually work together as a whole. So there's a lot of wisdom like this. Almost everything I would ask Master Nishioka about, he would then somehow come back to the environmental aspects, environmental understanding, thinking of this as an entirety. Certainly, again, wind, rain, sunlight. Another thing I mentioned, I like the joints and all this sort of stuff that involves measurement. He said it's not about the measurement, it's about the personality of the wood. Join the wood, combine the logs based on their personality, and also you have to do the same thing with carpenters, that you have to build, a team based on different personalities. And here's just a photo I took of 3 carpenters at work, and it was like they were dancing. There was silent, wordless cooperation, collaboration. Each person has his own strengths, and it's up to the master to provide them with that kind of work, not only for the sake of the building project, but also for their own development. And because Master Nishioka was a devout Buddhist, and I believe he was thinking of providing people with a path towards their own, perfection and enlightenment. And here's an example. This was a skinny high school kid, basically, on the site. And, he wasn't able to heft big logs, but Master Nishioka thought he would be good for detailed carving work, and he put him to work with that. And, within about a year, he was just doing exquisite carvings. This is this detail on the gable, this beautiful little, you can just see the one line on each side made with the chisel. This is actually so the water would drip off. He was actually, that was ideal work for him. Excuse me, I have a doorbell. And this is the master. And again, spending the time with him was only about 3 years. But it was life-changing for me, and it was a formative experience. I continued to work on different parts of, Japanese architecture, specifically compact housing and other things like that, that had a strong environmental and ecological aspects, and then devoted myself to studying the Edo period, because the Edo period was remarkable in its use of resources. And I will talk a little bit about that. That research became a book called Just Enough, which has gone through several editions. And in fact, a new edition is due from Stonebridge Press early next year. Actually, it's hard to find the English version now. You can look on Amazon. It's like $900. It's ridiculous. But there will be a new edition soon. A Japanese edition is still available. So the key point is that at the start of the Edo period, and this is around 1600, Japan had really put itself into an imminent environmental collapse by clear-cut foresting, by cutting all the trees during this expansionist, period beforehand, and they managed to avert it. And it's a remarkable instance of that. And I have some notes. I'll just read from the foreword of my book. This success can be credited partly to technological advances and partly to government direction. Agricultural breeding played a part, as did improved hydrology. Design was crucial, as was the timely collection and distribution of information. But more than anything else, this success was due to a pervasive mentality that propelled all of the other mechanisms of improvement. This mentality drew on an understanding of the functioning and inherent limits of natural systems. It encouraged humility, considered waste taboo, suggested cooperative solutions, and found meaning and satisfaction in a beautiful life in which the individual took just enough from the world and not more. And this had remarkable benefits for the society. It lasted for basically 250 years, a very sustainable society. The first thing they did was to gather information about the health and the environment. And specifically, they took a census of all of the trees. Basically, the shogunate said to all the feudal lords, all the daimyo, check your forests, find out how they're doing, figure out which ones need to be protected. And they implemented very, very strict laws to protect the forests. And of course, the forests were the sources of everything, building material, fuel, everything. And this meant that as the building trades evolved, for instance, everything was somehow recyclable and really forms an ideal for our own notions of what a very sustainable building can be like in terms of materials. So, for instance, a Japanese building, this is like a townhouse, a machiya. Everything can be reused if it's at end of life. They can dismantle it. The big beams and columns, there were markets that sold only used timber. These would go into the market again. Big floorboards, these thick boards, you could plane them to be new. Roof tiles obviously could be reused, even cedar shingles, anything of metal, the copper downspouts, things like nails. Iron was very, very valuable because it took a lot of fuel to run smithies and forges. So iron was valuable. That would be constantly recycled and turned into other things. All of the tatami and the doors, the shoji and the fusuma, and even the stones for the foundations, these things could all be somehow reused, recycled. And once the building was done, you could plant a garden the next day, basically. There was basically nothing left. So this was kind of an ideal for us. And we can say that the Edo material economy was a successful prototype for the circular economy. And we can talk more about that. Circular economy has really become much, a lot of discussion about this since about 2013, when some important reports came out from like the MacArthur Foundation, et cetera. But some of the design goals are to design out waste and pollution. You don't want any waste. Keep products and materials in use, make things regenerate natural systems, find a way that your design actually helps the environment, dematerialize things to reduce the resources they use, make things modular so they can be upgraded and repaired, extend the life of things, make sure things are in use for a long time, and try to provide services, if possible, where people don't have to actually own products. And all these things were strong characteristics of Edo period in terms of design and architecture, and are also ideals for what's emerging as a circular economy. Another aspect of this is what I call multiform solutions. We know this expression of to kill two birds with one stone, but in Edo, they were constantly coming up with solutions that killed 4 or 5 or 6 with one stone. And here's an example: is the public bath, the sento. And if you went to one in the Edo period, you'll be familiar. If you've gone to a sento today, you come in, you pay your money. Your admission charge basically gets you only 1 bucket of hot water. You can use all the cold water you want. You can go in the bath, soak in the big bathtub as much as you want. And this is because to make hot water, you need fuel. And fuel is a forest resource, and they wanted to conserve that. And this was simply a very good way to improve the hygiene of people, to have a social space, and to do it in a way that doesn't waste the resources of fuel. And this is not designed top down. This simply evolved. And this is a good example of a multiform solution. And I just at the end to point out that the Edo period was non-expansionist, and it was a non-growth economy, a rare example of an economy that is not based on growth. And this is in huge, contrast to the period before, where Japan was invading Korea, trying to get resources in Southeast Asia, et cetera. They said, let's stop that. And it had to do with a sense of governance, very pragmatic governance aimed at helping everyone. Good governance meant that all people, the life of all people was improving. So that's the end of my little presentation. And there's a lot more to talk about. I have a lot more images if any of those issues come up. And I can direct people to my website, azbybrown.com, and safecast.org.
Great. Thank you so much, Azby. This is terrific. So lots of questions, and I'm sure the audience has a lot of questions as well. Mm-hmm. Feel free to type them into Q&A, and I will see whether I can weave them into our conversation. So this, as a business scholar, I'm obviously fascinated by this last part about the Edo period not being based on growth. What was it based on? So of course, the United States, everything is about economic growth, and Japan hasn't had economic growth for 2 decades. So maybe there's something there. But if it's not based on growth, what is it based on? What were the drivers of the Tokugawa period?
Like anything, it was agriculture and making things and providing services, transportation, all of this. But the resources were very carefully recycled, reused, husbanded, or at least using 100%, of everything that they were doing. So, for instance, in the case of rice, the rice itself was the product, but the rice straw had dozens, if not hundreds, of uses to make everything from raincoats to hats to floor mats to cushions to whatever, and then could be composted, put back into the agricultural cycle, or it could be burned for ash, and this ash itself had a value for lots of other things. So it was saying we don't have to constantly go out and get new resources. We are going to figure out how to maximize the use of what we have within this archipelago itself. Close off the country. It's Sakoku period. It's closed off. They're just going to maximize the use of the resources they have, and not undertake any big economic programs that would require, resources from outside. And the forest was a key example. The fact that they were able to develop regenerative forestry, in other words, not just clear cutting and leaving bare hillsides, but replanting them and making sure that there were systems in place to ensure that those forests would grow healthy and in 50 years be able to be cut again for new wood. So it was really, like we talk about the circular economy, it really was those ideals to upcycle things as much as possible and to reuse them and to otherwise fully use all the resources.
I wonder whether it had anything to do with the fact that rice was basically money. And so money supply was limited by what nature was giving them, or, well, they had a credit system, of course, as well. But rice was used for the taxation of the farmers, right? Yeah. And the farmers didn't actually have a lot because the dime you took whatever rice they could get from these guys.
I think this is actually one of your areas of specialty, right? Rice is interesting because, yes, it was used as the basis of taxation, and this meant supporting the samurai, basically, the samurai classes. And farmers were required to surrender. The percentage changed. It depended, locally and over time, but about a third of their crop is probably a good average as tax. And, over the course of the Edo period, though, there was a constant improvement in agricultural productivity, which is actually also tied to these principles of just enough, of reuse, et cetera. And it had to do with fertilizers, and it had to do with breeding better plants, et cetera. And for instance, at the beginning of the Edo period, what's called karashiki, which is organic, like green matter, leaves, kind of compost, was used as fertilizer. And then later, commercial fertilizers, for instance, sardines, they would be squeezed mainly for their oil. Then the husks of the sardines, that could be sold as fertilizer. The same for rapeseed, that could be squeezed to get the oil, and then the rest would be sold as fertilizer. But when they started using human waste as fertilizer, agricultural production just skyrocketed. And this would be hot composted. It was actually very good for killing most of the pathogens. And this also was a multiform solution because basically most of this would come from cities. And at the beginning of the Edo period, early on, basically, if you were a landlord and you had a latrine for all your tenants to use in the public courtyard in your nagaya, whatever, you'd have to pay someone to clean it out. But ultimately, they were able to sell it. And there were bidding wars where farmers from different villages would come and say, we want to ensure that we can always come get the human waste from your toilet. So here's let's make a contract, et cetera. And there were brokers and different price differentials, et cetera. And this vastly improved agricultural productivity. It also improved public health because this stuff was not festering. You didn't have big outbreaks of cholera like you had in Europe and North America at this time. And it provided economic activity. And plus, by this time, late 19th century, for instance, we were already flushing this stuff into rivers. There was a huge polluting problem, and we're still basically doing that. And so they didn't need to purify the river. The Sumida River was reportedly clean enough that you could, make tea from it. And so this is a multiform solution. Just this one thing: use this human waste, get this out of the cities into the farms. It has a great spin-offs, this sort of synergies in many aspects. But back to the rice. If I may continue, it's interesting because rice was one economic staple, was one basis of the economy, but there was also a cash economy, and rice was convertible to cash, and the merchants were, of course, involved in this cash economy, and many became very, very prosperous, more prosperous, for instance, than in many cases daimyo, and certainly many samurai. Samurai were discouraged, if not prohibited, from participating in the cash economy. In other words, from selling things. And farmers were discouraged from doing that for a long time. Ultimately, though, cash crops became more important, things like cotton or indigo. And the other economic layer was what we call susawake, which is the distribution of excess. So samurai could not try to earn money, but they eventually were growing a lot of their own food, even in the city. They converted half of their gardens, if not more, to farm plots in the city, in Edo and in other cities. And they would grow a lot of, Greek eggplants, and they would distribute the excess to their friends and family, and other excess would come to them in another kind of circular economy, this sort of sharing economy. And this also happened in rural areas. It happened everywhere, and still happens today. Someone will give my grandmother, a crate of apples, and she'll give them to everyone, and we'll get some mikan, and we give them to everyone. So this is still a thing. So there was like 3 different economic systems operating in parallel. And that also persisted and allowed everyone's needs to be met.
So Robert wonders whether the early Tokugawa years, at least, weren't a period of significant economic growth. And I guess they were, but because there were technology advanced. So we're not talking about necessarily a stagnant thing, right? There's a lot of the metabolism worked. There's a lot of things going around.
For a long time, many theorists and historians characterize the Edo period as one of stagnation, but it was not really. And there was constant improvement and constant economic activity, constant innovation. It was a very innovative time. So we could say growth. You could say, well, yeah, you could have growth in one daimyo, in one han, in one province vis-a-vis their neighbors, for instance. These are growing. Maybe they're now exporting their shoyu, from Kansai to Kanto, or their sake. There would be growth like that, but not in the sense of seeking new external sources of raw materials. And this whole notion, this what we call the linear economy, which is extract resources, make something from them, then that is sold, and then it is somehow discarded or incinerated or put into landfill or something like that. This is a linear economy. This was very much more, again, a circular economy. How can we keep this stuff cycling back to continue to get value from it? This was the thinking behind it.
So we have a lot of questions that want us to go into the future or the present tense. Let's go. But before we go to the present tense, so my question would be, well, that's great. So during the Tokugawa period, there was a lot of care about the environment, and let's grow these trees. And then your sensei thought of the trees as still living, right? So they had to be aligned with the direction in which they grew. And that's sort of this anime thing that kind of enters this as well. How could Japan then end up with Minamata? And Minamata was, of course, the huge pollution, and I'm skipping 100 years or so, right? So, and I'm sure you'll take us through this, but Minamata was one of the biggest pollution scandals in the 1970s, and it was basically the opposite to everything you just said. So, how did they lose it? I guess.
I guess again, look, to characterize, Edo period thinking, this includes governance, this notion that, the rulers have a responsibility to the people, to everyone. And it's not to make a few people very, very wealthy. It's to try to help everyone get what they need. It required, in order to do what they did in terms of the environment, preserving it, it required a lot of people to constantly be monitoring and taking care of the environment, certainly in their corner, in their village, in their town, etc. For instance, the Satoyama, this is the mountains that surround a village. The lower, reaches of those mountains were very intensively used for gathering firewood, for food. You could call them sort of, managed forests. And this also allowed the people to go into the forest and to understand what was happening in the environment. If there was unusual rainfall or unusual drought or something else happening, they would know very, very soon. They would be able to perceive that and take action if necessary. The fuel was the biggest limiter. They knew the people in that period were only allowed, in the villages, only allowed to use wood that had naturally fallen onto the ground for fuel. They were not allowed to, in most cases, to cut trees actually just to burn them. And this imposed a sort of natural limit on their fuel use. And again, this went all the way down to the sento, to people's using charcoal in their hibachis at home, etc. Everything was used to maximize the economy of the fuel. The Meiji period basically broke that chain by introducing fossil fuels, particularly initially coal, and often it was first sourced within Japan. And those mines were eventually depleted, and we had lots of coal being sourced from China. And of course, this is one of the things that led to the Second World War. Lots of imports of fossil fuels, later oil, etc. Initially, this was for industrial use, to power the machines, to make the metals, to make the textiles, etc. But ultimately to home use. And once that link was broken, that people are limiting their resource use to what's available, particularly for fuel initially. Once that's broken, then it sort of cascades down. And the basic thing, it became a growth economy. It became a competitive economy. And let's face it, the Meiji period rulers did a great job of keeping Japan from becoming colonized, of making a modern state and a modern economy, but it had huge costs environmentally and also in some of these social and value aspects. So, ultimately it brought us things like Minamata. It brought us horrific pollution in the cities in the 1970s. It's much better now than it was then. But it really led to great depredation, both within the country, again, cutting all the forests in Japan during the 20th century, during the wartime. Lots of things happening in Asian countries, et cetera. So it was really, I think the key link was breaking that natural limit to the use of fuel. Maybe there was no other way to do massive production than to use these fossil fuels. Today, we might have alternatives, but at the time, that was the only way they could do it.
So after Minamata, of course, there was a sort of a change of, okay, we can't do this. This is not sustainable, right? So in some ways, Japan was actually fairly early in realizing that this cannot go on. We have to change things. Mm-hmm. And there was some environmental movements. And then, of course, Fukushima brought another sort of whole thing about that. So we have two questions on today. And the first is from Nancy, who wonders whether there are any examples of any methods, architects, practices that are active today that are good examples of the Edo circular economy. That is to say, is Japan making efforts to go all the way back and kind of bring in some of these practices to
in architecture
today?
Well, the interesting thing is, I imagine maybe some people tuned into this talk expecting to see a lot of pictures of buildings, beautiful buildings, whereas you may notice that I'm concentrating on the invisible aspects, right? Energy use, reuse, functionality, modularity, these things. I would say that, every architect who's studied in Japan, who was trained in Japan, has learned a lot from traditional Japanese architecture in one way or the other. Japanese architecture itself, traditional architecture, is held up as a very almost ideal model for passive solar architecture that's naturally cooled in the summer, for instance, that makes very good use of sunlight, etc. Also the integration of the house and garden, this wonderful symbiosis that we see. It's not just beautiful, it has a lot of benefits in terms of environment, planting trees, to break the wind, and having trees in your garden that provide food, for instance, and having water features that also provide microclimates and habitat and things. These are all well understood and I think have continued into the present. But when we get into an industrial scale of building, large buildings, it becomes much more theoretical. And I think Japan has probably learned more in sustainable building from developments in other parts of the world, for instance, Europe, for instance, Germany, than it has from its own tradition. That said, there is a big push towards, minimizing waste, minimizing energy use. And you pointed out, certainly in the 20th century, in the post-war period, in response to terrible pollution. And I think, Japanese building and manufacturing is pretty energy efficient. I don't think anyone holds it up as the ideal for sustainability now. It could be. I mean, Japan could be all of that. Could be the source for the best sustainable ideas in the world if they wanted to focus that, but they actually haven't. But yet, I think there is a lot of good energy use and other sustainable aspects of Japanese building now. And again, I mentioned circular economy. It was interesting. There was a big conference about 3 years ago in Yokohama, and many major manufacturers, Toyota, Hitachi, big contractors, participated to tout their efforts at helping bring the circular economy into existence. So people are getting on board with this idea, and I think they can learn a lot from Edo. But I would say, basically, if you look at a new Japanese office building or a big apartment building, you won't find a lot from Edo in it.
How about Cassandra wonders whether, she was struck by your story about the trees and how somehow in the Tokugawa period, Japan managed to reforest the country. Does Japan currently have a system of long-term forest husbandry to support future building needs in the same way that they had in the past?
The short answer is no. I mean, there are a lot of people who see that and think it's important and would like to help that happen. But really, Japanese forests have largely been abandoned. And most of them are privately owned. I mentioned earlier there was huge deforestation during the Second War, and then again in the post-war period, for building new homes, etc. But over the decades, it's been cheaper to import wood from Southeast Asia and elsewhere than to use Japanese timber. The cost of getting it off the mountain is simply higher. And consequently, a lot of them have been abandoned. They need to be husbanded. People need to go in and thin them out and to cut a certain number of trees to make the other ones grow in a healthier way. But this has not been happening very much in Japan. There are some good forests, but generally not. There is a push, though, a movement afoot to do this and to help restore Japanese forests to their earlier state. Now, one thing that happened in the Edo period was that mountains everywhere were planted with the most valuable timbers, mainly cedar and hinoki. Were the big ones, and sugi, and so consequently these became sort of monoculture plantations even in the 18th century, and a lot of the forests now still have that aspect. Initially, before that happened, they were mixed forests with deciduous trees, hardwood species, some evergreens, etc. And there are people in different parts of the country who are making efforts to restore forests to that condition.
Well, that's interesting. The Japanese government is all about regional, chiho sosei, and how can we revitalize the regions. And in some of those areas, I'm thinking, well, why is it so bad if some of these regions are actually not revitalized? I mean, it's sad for a number of people, but in terms of a balance for the entire country, is there a movement actually to say, well, can we just have nature take over some of these places again?
It's interesting because we talked about Fukushima, and I spent a lot of time there over the past decade, and really know a lot of people, a lot of communities, and some people doing really, really interesting work environmentally in places like Itate village. And there has been conversation that it may be better in some cases to let things revert to nature. And again, it doesn't have to just be wild and unmanaged. It can be managed to some degree. It could be a good way. What you're seeing, and we're all looking at this aging population and the emptying out of villages. This is magnified tenfold in Fukushima and other parts of Tohoku. So if a village is going to be empty, if it's not viable, then maybe it does make sense to have people come and make new centers where there can be sort of the necessary critical mass to make a viable a village or viable town out of that, and let the rest revert. But again, the key, agricultural activity is important. And one of the problems now, there's not a lot of arable land in Japan, and it's been very intensively used already since the Edo period. Pretty much it was all opened and in production since the Edo period. Very little has been reopened since then. In fact, the opposite, as urbanization has happened, certainly in the Tokyo area. Large areas of former farmland are now, urban. And, one of the issues is how to maintain as much local agricultural production as possible, considering that the farming population is aging out of it and younger people are not doing this. So these are all connected. Japan has beautiful natural scenery, has beautiful places. I think, to do a planned depopulation of certain areas, a planned de-densification of certain areas, and to move the density to other parts in a planned way could and should be done. Unfortunately, I don't see that happening in terms of policy. It may be happening on a local level, prefectural level, a certain municipal level, but I don't see it as a well understood issue by the central government.
Yeah, so it's interesting because the digital transformation will also bring vertical farming. And so we can bring the farms into the cities and let the trees occupy, but that's maybe for another day. Robbie wants us to go back to the Edo period, and he has two questions that are fantastic. The first is, what happened? So back to our earlier conversation about the rice and the farmers and the samurai getting a stipend that would never increase, therefore being sort of an anti-inflationary, built-in regulator, I guess. He wants to know what happened to income distribution in the Edo period, and then also in terms of you're part of the conversation about energy efficiency. How did the Edo folks, also the Tokugawa government, I guess, think about energy efficiency and high prices and regulation and housing rules? Were they organized around that in those?
Yeah, let's talk about that first. In terms of income distribution, again, as you point out, the samurai classes were on fixed incomes, and this had huge impacts, positive and negative impacts, and negative primarily for them. Lots of peasants, farmers could become wealthy. I mean, a small percentage of all of them, but there were able to be very upwardly mobile and wealthy. There was a lot of tenant farming as well, people who were dispossessed, who were, working indentured, labor. So I'm not going to pretend it was all good for everybody all the time. There were a lot of other issues. We would not consider it an egalitarian society at all. Samurai could legally cut down anybody, kill anybody, simply for insult, legally. And we don't know how often that actually happened, but legally they were allowed to do that. In terms of regulation, what struck me was the degree to which market forces regulated a lot of it. It was fairly laissez-faire. You could say that, so the local, daimyo, the local lord would say, okay, these are our protected forests, and I'm going to give the rights to log these to this, lumber person, and there would be money coming in from that as well. But basically, it was pretty hands-off. The market did most of it naturally. And I think the fact that there were what are called tomeyama, closed forests, the fact that forests were closed legally, with huge, incredible penalties, life. You would execution for entering these kinds of forests with an axe or a saw, with a cutting tool. It was death penalty for that. And, that limited the amount that could be cut. That was carefully controlled by each local han, by each local daimyo. And that meant that, well, the supply was going to be predictable, and the prices would be predictable. And then if you were a lumber person, you would maximize your value by having the best quality of wood, the clearest grained hinoki, etc., the better keyaki or whatnot, or, having it good stocks of lumber in Edo, because there were so many fires, you'd have a good stock of lumber and be able to make a lot of money after a fire to help people rebuild things. But a lot of it was just the economy. So because, this was a significant percentage of people's income went to fuel, for instance, they were going to conserve it. And all the kitchen design, like the kamado cook stove, and the hibachi, and even the little iron rings that the pots, the water pots would go on, these were all progressively designed and refined to minimize the use of fuel. And this was simply because it was economic for people. The same for other recycling. Things were recycled because they would sell that. They would sell their used paper. They would sell their used clothes. They would sell all this stuff and trade it in for something new. So this was, an economic incentive for the people, for average people to participate in this stuff.
So the Tokugawa period, of course, had a sort of a case system, a shino kosho, right? So the farmers at the top and the merchants at the bottom. And I've looked a little bit at those merchants, and there were some very successful ones, Yodoya in Osaka, for instance.
Yes.
And so back to Robbie's question on income distribution. So my understanding is that when they got too rich and they started to flaunt their wealth, the daimyo would notice and come and expropriate all their wealth.
Yeah.
And the daimyo could do that because they were technically his servant. So what the shonin, the merchants, did is, in some cases, Yodoya was a front runner maybe in this, is they would keep their wealth in kimono and give these kimono to their wives so that they would not be expropriated. I don't know why women could not be expropriated, but that's maybe another story. So there was a kimono thing there going on as well, right? As a storage of wealth.
Yeah, that's interesting. And, to be honest, I don't know that much about the economics of that aspect of kimonos, but it fits in with everything. Yes, there were sumptuary laws that were intended to, minimize consumption of things, and also to keep people in their place. And for instance, if you were a merchant, you were not allowed to have a tea house. So what merchants who were interested in tea did would find ways to hide tea rooms in their houses. They were not allowed to have lacquer. They were not allowed to have, red kimonos, things like this. So they found ways. There's a whole famous, story about Edo, the so-called the tsu, this notion of iki, this high sense, these sophisticated, dapper men who, for instance, the lining of the kimono would be red. But outside was a very gray or black or something like that. And then just some red threads would be visible. So there was a lot of this, cat and mouse with people getting wealthy enough that they want to show it off. And then the government, the daimyo, the samurai, wanting to squash that.
And that's true today too, right? So you go to Tokyo, there are a lot of wealthy people in Japan, but you wouldn't know by the cut of the coat. You would know from the cloth of which the coat is made, right? And so if you know, you can see it. I think to this day, there's even some talk that angel investing in startup companies is not really that common because it could be interpreted as flaunting.
That's interesting. Wealth. I hadn't heard that.
That's definitely, there's a culture around, you don't show off, which was the Horiemon's problem, right? He was in flip-flops and he drove around in a red Ferrari in downtown Tokyo, and no, you don't do that.
But there's a lot of flaunting, and there's a lot of
so back to the environment. Douglas has a question that comes that's really of my interest as well, and he observes that, of course, there's a lot of throwaway architecture in Japan. That the average lifespan of a house is pretty short, maybe less than 30 years, and then after that it's torn down, and or if it's not torn down, then it's just sitting there. And so first of all, the architecture today that I'm not understanding much about architecture, but what I see in buildings in Tokyo is that they're not built to last necessarily. And so that's one thing. And then the other ones, that's like the old ones that were made to last are actually not torn down. So can you talk a little bit about?
I'm from New Orleans in the United States, which is a fairly old city for North America, and not compared to Europe or Japan, but a lot of old houses. People value old houses. If there was a house, two houses the same size, and one was 150 years old and one was recent, the same cost, same size, almost everyone would prefer to have the older house because they were better built. They have charm. They have stories. This is not the case here. I was very surprised to learn when I came to Japan how little interest there was in maintaining old houses, old buildings. And I talked to a lot of people about it, including my mother-in-law. Some of it is, they just think it's creepy, or people think they're dark and hard to keep clean, or lots of issues like that. But there are so many people since then, in the 30 years that I've been here, learning how to renovate and doing wonderful renovations and restorations of farmhouses, making them comfortable, making them, have modern kitchens and baths, etc. It's not that hard to do, but there is this mindset. And I think part of it has to do with this sense of shame of having something old, that, people want to have something new. They've been persuaded by the building industry, which is really an incredible marketing industry, marketing lifestyle. They've been persuaded that the new one is better. And compared to the very substandard housing that was erected very quickly after the Second War, and we know every city was burned to the ground, and people were living in under corrugated tin sheets. It was a terrible situation. So things had to be built quickly, and there was not a lot of good lumber material. So it was built substandard. So from that point of view, from something that was built in the 1940s or 1950s, you would want to replace it with something better as soon as you could, and that made sense. But I do think it's had this terrible effect on people's sense of value, which Douglas is pointing out.
So accomplishment is associated with newness.
Newness is everything. You see this trend. I mean, when I came to Japan 30 years ago, you could furnish your house because people were throwing out perfectly usable televisions and sofas and things just to get a new one, right? You could furnish your house with that stuff. But I think this is The older buildings form the fabric of our communities. They tell our stories. They are part of our identity, and this is true everywhere. And I do think you see this all over Japan as well. Many towns, many villages, many places, people do value that, but economically, it's become difficult for them to maintain that kind of lifestyle that uses and preserves older buildings. I was shocked at how many buildings in Kyoto were demolished since I've been here. Entire neighborhoods of beautiful old townhouses being demolished and turned into apartments and things. So this is kind of shocking, but there's a mindset, there's a value, there's this cult of newness is part of it. Plus, the fact that the building industry itself has not presented the solutions like they did in the United States in the 1960s and 70s when people wanted to retrofit their houses with insulation or new plumbing or new skylights or something like that. So it is a real value crisis, I think, and maybe people are figuring it out. I hope people are learning about it. I do see much more restoration than I did 30 years ago, and that's a good thing. But overall, it's demolish, scrap and build.
Yes, I think we saw the same thing in automobiles. So there was actually, it's not a big used car market in Japan, at least until the 90s.
And all those overseas.
Yes, and
that's a huge industry.
But that was actually also government made, because the government had these shaken, like these automobile.
Yes. The registration. The registration
is
so high.
Right? It's a
After
safety
5
test.
years, it gets to be prohibitively expensive. So you should get a new car.
That's right.
I remember. My first car, was 10 years old. When I was in my 20s, it was an old car, and you just don't have that here. It means that young people can't really buy cars, and it's a real strange thing. We used one of our cars for 12 years, and people were amazed. That was here, in Yokohama, amazed to use it for 12 years. But it was in great shape. It was still running fine.
So on this point, Anne wonders whether the housing situation or the old house situation is a similar thing. That is to say that it's basically very difficult to get a bank loan to do anything with. Yes. It's easy to get a loan to build a new house. It's much more difficult to get a loan to rebuild something. So is this baked into the system?
Yeah, it's like self-fulfilling prophecy, right? So the bank will say, "Oh, we aren't going to give you a loan because we're not going to be able to easily resell that if you default on the loan." And also, consequently, no one's going to get a loan to do this. So no one's going to have an opportunity to actually see how good they are. And it's self-fulfilling. The same for apartments, same for everything. You can market any kind of 1 LDK, 2 LDK. But if you do something a little unusual, it's difficult to get a loan and difficult for the real estate industry to market that. So it's about expectations. There's a lot of good things about the housing stock in Japan and in Tokyo and in terms of costs, et cetera. And there's a lot of positive to say about that. But it's so strange. Again, you can go to lots of villages, and I see some people I know here in the chat, people going to the rural areas, and you can pick up an old farmhouse. Basically, people are giving them away. You can get a 200-year-old farmhouse for a song on a big chunk of property, and you may have to put a little elbow grease into it, but it can be beautiful and be a wonderful place to live. So it is strange, and it is. I think Anne used the word collusion, and in a way it is. Just like this was a collusive thing between the government and the automobile industry in terms of setting the price of registrations. This was a collusion, or let's say it's a government. Let's
go to the developmental policy.
The industry,
right?
Beg your pardon?
Developmental policy. You sell more cars.
And there is certainly similar developmental policy in building. And now, of course, it's trying to be greener. It's trying to be, more energy efficient. It's trying to be more sustainable. And that will be a good thing.
So what is the situation there right now? The current environmental minister is very popular, Mr. Koizumi.
He just announced that 30 years from now, nuclear will be less important to the energy grid than solar. That was a big change in policy. Rather in 2030, I think, that's a big change. So it's interesting. My point of view, I look at Edo again. The market did most of the work. If you let the market respond, if you provide people with alternatives, people are seeking alternatives. And that can be service. That is the source of new business, of new goods, new kinds of goods, new kinds of thinking. I think people vote with their pocketbooks and they vote with their feet, right? So people do want to be more sustainable. There is a rise in what we call the value-based consumer here. You do see this, and you see this in marketing, which is often greenwash. It's always going to be highlighted: the energy efficiency, Energy Star, energy this, water, blah blah blah. You'll see this in the marketing, and reflected to some degree in actuality. And I think there's been great strides in certainly Japanese, appliance manufacturing and other fields in terms of energy use and recyclability, et cetera. But people have to demand it. And they have to know that there are alternatives. And if you go to any, like Japan has these wonderful, home shows, and they're there for years and years, and the constantly new model homes being built. You'll see this reflected in the industry and how they're marketing homes. So again, some of it is lip service, greenwash, but a lot of it is real.
So this is a little bit of sort of a very different question, but in terms of architecture. So one of Japan's biggest contribution to architectural design in the world, by my limited understanding, is minimalism, right? So the minimalism and the art in the little and the sort of, does that come out of these observations? Does that come out of what are the roots of that? Is that also part of this cycle, and let's not overdo it and keep it
There's so many intertwined threads that have led to this minimal sensibility, and we could say Zen Buddhism, of course, had a huge impact on this, and the title of my book, Just Enough, comes from something carved into a water basin at Ryoanji Temple in Kyoto, which is Ware Tada Taru o Shiru. When you could translate, it's kind of an anagram, you can translate it many ways, but it means I only need enough, or I only care about enough. I only need to know what enough is. And so this is definitely reflected in everything that comes and associated with Zen, from tea ceremony to, lots of painting and interiors, etc. But the Edo period, of course, this maximizing the use of resources, what I referred to as this sort of dematerialization, do things with as little material as possible. And make them modular, make them compact. And again, remember that in Edo, in the town of Edo, 2/3 of the population were living in tenements, in these one-room apartments. Basically, they're called nagaya, which means long house, and they were nice community design. They were very, very good. But there was one room, and everything had to be able to be put away and folded up and, compact and collapsed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this was a huge impetus to this kind of design. And again, that was on the daily basis for the middle classes and the lower classes. Upper classes, of course, had beautiful compact designed implements, boxes, furnishings, etc. in their house as well. Not necessarily because they needed it, but because it was aesthetically pleasing. And this was a beautiful part of this, that this attitude towards design became aesthetically preferable. It became a point of pride to have something well designed and compact. And this is, something I wish could happen now. I think it can happen now, rather than, the person with the biggest, SUV. Oh, that's the person we're all, envious of. The person with the most efficient vehicle, the most compact, efficient vehicle, that should be a point of pride for people. And I think it could be, but it requires a shift in value towards looking to the invisible aspects, how things actually work, how they function, how they are improving our life and our environment.
And in mayhap, so California, of course, has a huge water challenge right now. And what we see, though, is that a lot of people turn to stone gardens.
Yeah.
Which is yet another way of conserving
dry
water.
Gardens.
And, you can find
maybe with a few drought-resistant plants. And this is a wonderful development. I mean, again, in the recent decades, landscape architecture, environmental design has become very sophisticated, a lot of knowledge from different parts of the world as well, including here, for making gardens or landscape design that fits the environment. The opposite side would be things like in Portland and other places, designing sort of wetland gardens, that can help mitigate flooding, because flooding happens naturally. So you can design gardens that are actually habitats in small wetlands. This is a biotope. These are beautiful things. And certainly in California and in the western states, in the Southwest, dry gardens is a big thing. So there's a lot, I think, learned from Japan for some of these things, to know that, yeah, this can actually be beautiful. It's actually sophisticated. Right. You can do this in a wonderfully aesthetically pleasing way.
Yeah, minimalism can be beautiful. Let me close with a question that Hugh Patrick always asked me, Professor Patrick from Columbia always asked me to ask, which is, what worries you most these days?
Climate change. Oh. And, we've been talking about this for decades, and I am, in preparation for the new edition of Just Enough, I'm making a new preface, and that caused me to think, when I wrote the book, it was already, 12 years ago, basically. What was I hoping would happen? Look at this problem, look at these looming problems of climate change and overpopulation and problems with agricultural productivity and freshwater. All these problems, these linked problems, required prompt action, concerted action, serious action on the part of government and industry and the general public. And that didn't really happen. And we have a situation in the United States where we had the previous regime actually took down climate data from the EPA website, basically concealed all that stuff, was it was saying, no, that's all nonsense. Understanding how difficult it is politically to get people on board with this stuff. I was naive. I thought that it would be obvious to everyone, and we have the alternatives, and I was aware of that. All the people working on these issues around the world, they're doing fantastic work. It's clear, how to work with forests and livestock and farms and water, and they're all talking to each other. They're speaking the same language. It's amazing what we know now and what we are able to do. We are capable of doing if we decide to do it. But it hasn't happened. And the forces that of inertia and let's say vested interests that block this remain very, very powerful. And the fossil fuel industry would be a great example. And we're seeing some interesting legal cases now where I think Shell Oil was recently, basically told that they're responsible for all this damage to the environment, to people's health from fossil fuels. So this is, this has to change. But the market will play an essential role. And as we see, solar energy is coming down in cost because the market is growing and there's innovation in the industry. And it's now cheaper than a lot of other sources of energy. So this will become obviously an obvious choice based on market forces. And other things like that, I think, can happen.
It's a great note to end on. And as we hopefully move to a more enlightened way of thinking about the environment, we can probably learn more from Japan going forward. So thank you, Azby Brown, for joining us today.
Thank you.
And it's a great conversation. And everybody, next week, it's Dave Lahaney, who's going to talk about some of the things that Japan wanted to celebrate, but could not, including the Olympics, the recent Emperor's 60th birthday, the anniversary of the Meiji Restoration, all kinds of things, and what that means that this could not be celebrated. So we're continuing a little bit on today's topics, I think. Next week, see you again, 4:30 p.m. Tuesday. Until then, please stay safe and take good care. I'll see you next week. Thank you, Azby.
Thank you.